Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for being here. I'm very excited to be here, a part of this conference, to kick off the day's events with a fantastic panel. My name is William Donch. I'm an assistant professor of literature at Fordham University, and I'm delighted to introduce I'm moderating and also speaking, and delighted to introduce my co-panelists here. First off, Professor Mary Graw-Leary is a professor of law at the Catholic University of America, Columbus School of Law. Once a federal prosecutor, now Professor Graw-Leary's scholarship examines the intersection of criminal law, technology, and contemporary victimization. She works on the exploitation and abuse of women, children, and the marginalized. She currently directs the Law School Modern Prosecution Program, as well as the Vaquita Initiative for the Study and Disruption of Modern Slavery. In addition to her scholarship on exploitation, she's the lead author of Perspectives on Missing Persons Cases, and also has written extensively about the role of religion in combating human trafficking and the need for victim rights in clergy abuse cases. Casey Shalomsky, all right, is a divinity student at the University of Aberdeen. Her research interests include the intersection of literature and theology, disability theology, and fiction of Flannery O'Connor. If she could live anywhere, it would be just outside Oxford with a good view of its spires. And I guess we're not that far away.
We're not.
As I said, my name is William Donch. I'm an assistant professor and director of the literature program at Ave Maria University. I work on 20th and 21st century American literature, especially the creative exchange between religious and secular styles and religious imagination in spaces imagined as secular. And I've been a longtime fan of Flannery O'Connor, longtime member of the community, and was delighted to be part of the 2023 National Endowment for the Humanities Summer Institute on O'Connor, which Bruce Gentry here and Bob Donahue were kind enough to direct and organize. And I know a lot of people in this room were connected to that. So we're going to kick things off with Professor Graw-Leary.
Thanks. I know what you're asking yourselves. How did she get into this conference with that kind of a bio? Fair enough, fair enough. But I want to first thank the Kern Center at Fordham University. I want to thank the Hank Center from Loyola Chicago and Georgetown University and the Mary Flannery O'Connor Trust for making this all happen. This is really super wonderful. But the question you have, I want to pose a slightly different question. This is a question that faced me in January of last year. What is a nice Irish Catholic criminal law professor from New England to do when she finds herself in Athens, Georgia for 4 months, and when she Googles masstimes.org and the closest parish is 38 miles away? Well, there's really only one answer. It is to get yourself to the Flannery O'Connor archives and to start doing some research on her work and your field of practice. So that's exactly what I did. And this paper that I'm going to present, a version of it's going to be published at the Notre Dame Journal of Law, Ethics, and Public Policy. And the research is still ongoing, so I welcome any comments, etc. For our plan today, I want to talk a little bit about the origins of this paper, talk a little bit about vocation, and then sort of my thesis on O'Connor. The origin here is where there is violence, there is usually crime. And where there's crime, there's usually the criminal law. So I went to the archives planning to do a research project in which I would be looking at the influence of crime and criminal law on O'Connor's writing. And I experienced what is so often the case with Flannery O'Connor. What you think is going to happen is a little bit different than what O'Connor actually does to you, and in my case, for you. What I found was there was surprisingly little written about Flannery O'Connor and the law. There's a little bit, but so that was very interesting. But what I expected to find was this one-way relationship, real life criminal events, criminal law things that influenced her writing. And I certainly found that, and we'll talk about that. But what I also found was what I'm referring to as a two-way dialogue. So hence the title, the symbiotic or collaborative relationship, where O'Connor has a great deal to offer today's lawyers and today's criminal prosecutors. I don't know if I'm gonna have enough time to get into that part of the paper, but I want to tell you a little bit of my a story about that to sort of help frame it, and then we'll get into our agenda. So I'm sitting there in the archives and I'm reading her works and I'm laughing out loud, as many of us have done, with her wit at her original writings. And she's writing a lot about her frustration, right? Trying to reach an audience. It's complicated, that doesn't seem to really want to hear. And I had a flashback to my early days as a criminal prosecutor. Now, I realize it's not vogue to be a criminal prosecutor these days, but I would just invite you to consider that it is a very noble profession to speak for the vulnerable. But I found myself feeling exactly how I felt as a young prosecutor in a busy Philadelphia courtroom, domestic violence courtroom, where I'm sitting there trying to prove my case and feeling like I am the only one in this room who's looking at these photos of a woman with 2 black eyes, or looking at these photos of a child who's been abused, or what have you, who wants to prosecute this case, who thinks it's wrong. Now, I'm dating myself a little bit, but I had judges who are like, your victim isn't here, let's just move along. Court reporters who are like, you're in between me and lunch. Police officers who are like, when are you going to sign my timesheet? But I am sitting here going, no, you have to listen to me. It is not okay to hurt these folks. And as I'm reading what O'Connor's writing about, that has been my, it just came right back to me. So that's the inspirational framework for the paper. Let me suggest to you 3 things, right? It's been documented, of course, that O'Connor not only had an active imagination, but she's influenced by real events. And so we'll talk about that a little bit. But I argue that she uses the criminal law in her work in a very specific way, as what I refer to as almost a silent character that is often the catalyst for events, often the catalyst for events. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, you shoehorned this talk just to get here for this conference. You're going to leave right after your presentation. But think about it. If you think about, obviously, Mr. Shiflett, you'll remember his conversations about the law and the wedding, et cetera, and whether he felt good about it. You'll recall Mason Tarwater's efforts to fix the his entail so that his grandson could take over his have his property. Desegregation itself floating around in so many of these stories. So I argue to you that this criminal law plays a role as a silent character, but also as one particularly emerging when the law fails. And it particularly comments upon the failure to protect the most vulnerable. So let's frame the conversation a little bit. Talking about O'Connor approaching her writing as a vocation is sort of like mentioning it rains in London. I understand that we all know this, but I want to highlight a couple of points here because we know that O'Connor approached her writing as a vocation. And I think that that is really important. She understood her work in that way as from the Latin vocatio, a summons or a call, or also a voice. And I think that's really important. And while we used to apply that to just a religious context, of course, it applies to the secular context as well. Doctors, a vocation of medicine, they don't go, it's 5 o'clock, I guess I'm finishing up with the surgery, right? Hopefully that doesn't happen. Clergy, oh, you're having a spiritual crisis. Gosh, I got a place to go. Never happens. I'm Father's confirming that, so that's good. I appreciate that. Some professions are a constant calling, pulling on you all the time, yanking on you all the time. And she wrote about this. So being a writer is a matter of vocation. And it wasn't just a vocation in a secular sense, but you can see from this quote, as well as others, that she talks about it very much in a theological or religious text as well, most famously in the prayer journal, talking about her as a typewriter for the Lord, etc. But her vocation was not simply, as we all know, to be a really great writer. That was, of course, important to her. But she had this desire to, as we all know, to talk about grace, right? To bring that message of grace to her audience. And that was really critical to her. And she found that violence was a tool to making that happen, okay? She found violence strangely capable of returning her characters to reality and preparing them for their moment of grace, okay? If we accept that violence is a part of her vocational framework to what she's doing. And then I would suggest we can accept that the criminal law plays in this as well. And the paper discusses numerous examples. I'm going to focus on 2 examples of real life incidents that I would argue influenced her writing. And the first will be the Partridge Family, as you would expect. Stories often maligned. I don't have to use up my valuable 28 minutes summarizing it, but you'll just recall Calhoun returning to Partridge for the Azalea Festival, and a few days earlier there had been this terrible mass killing, which killed both prominent people in the community as well as a bystander. You'll recall as well, looming large in the story is Quincy Mental Hospital, where Calhoun and Mary Elizabeth go to interview who they think is the victim, the offender themselves. And a lot has been written about how this event was pulled from a similar event that took place in Milledgeville in 1953, a mass murder. And I'm going to focus on that in the writing. The similarities are both the physical similarities in the book as well as the situational similarities. Okay, so how many of you have had the pleasure of going to Milledgeville? Maybe most of you. Okay, so there you go. There you go. Milledgeville is a great place. So this will be familiar to you. The descriptions, of course. So one thing that looms large is the Central State Hospital, right? The mental institution that was there when O'Connor was there. And that is depicted there on the left. As you probably know, at the time, Milledgeville was notorious. There's lots of writings about how mothers would tell their children, I'm going to send you to Milledgeville, quote unquote, etc. It looms large. The paper talks about a time when a journalist came to visit Flannery O'Connor in the evening. She locked 3 locks on the doors, and he says, "Why this ritual?" And she says, "Well, there's a mental hospital down on the cross town, and there's a juvenile home on the other side of town, so we don't want unwanted visitors." So this was a big thing in the town, and with respect to her. Atlanta Magazine described the place as so massive and ubiquitous that they had at one point 12,000 residents with a 1 to 100 ratio of doctors to patients. The town is described down to, it's 5 blocks from the aunt's house down to downtown, which is just about the distance from the Klein Mansion to downtown, etc. Okay, so physically, we know this is based on this. She also said this, right? She famously published the story at her mother's request, not in a place where people from Milledgeville could read it, so it would not cause any trouble. But the murderous event, many of you are probably familiar with as well. This on the right is the case law for it, the opinion, just to prove I'm not making up things, because as a lawyer, we like to have footnotes, okay? Many of you know the story, but for those of you who don't, 1953, Marion Stembridge, on the eve of the sesquicentennial, shoots 2 prominent attorneys very publicly about this. Stembridge is a very interesting figure. He's referred to in the research as both a moneylender and a loan shark, has a history of mental health challenges and problems. But what's interesting, and what I think might be critical in the story, is just a few years before, he was charged with the 1949 killing of an 18-year-old African-American woman, Emma Jonathan. I don't have a picture of Miss Jonathan. I hadn't been able to find one, and I recently discovered an article which said she's in an unmarked grave. But the events of this killing, it's a little bit muddy, but he goes to collect a debt from 2 folks, 2 brothers. And Ms. Jonathan and another woman, Mary Jane Harrison, intervene when they see he and his friend Centenary, he's got brass knuckles. And they intervene to try to help, which results in Ms. Jonathan being beaten by him with the brass knuckles. She runs into the other side of the duplex. He chases after her, shoots her 3 times, once in the abdomen. He also shoots her colleague as well, and Ms. Johnson dies. although his partner was not, those of you who tell you can indict everything but a ham sandwich, that is a lie. His partner was not indicted, even though it is believed he discharged his firearm into not Miss Jonikin, but another. But he was charged with murder, all white male jury convicted him of manslaughter, and he was sentenced to 1 to 3 years in jail, not a day of which he served. So at the time of the mass murder that is the backdrop for the Partridge Festival, he had not served that sentence. This case went up on 2 appeals all the way to the United States Supreme Court, affirmed unanimously. However, a judge who also was the brother of his new attorney and law partner granted what is referred to in the research as habeas corpus, and he never served a day in jail. And that's not how habeas corpus works. And I haven't been able to figure all that out. There's not a written opinion, etc. So it seems a little bit shady. But at that time, his attorney was a guy named Marion Ennis. And that was his defense attorney, Mr. Ennis, here on the top right-hand corner. And he believed that Mr. Ennis tipped off the feds to his tax evasion and things. And he was under federal investigation for tax evasion. And he was convicted earlier, and his sentencing was not going to be May 2nd, it was going to be a little bit later. And so on May 2nd, he goes down downtown to Mr. Ennis's office, which is above the bookstore at the time, above the movie theater / bookstore. And he shoots and kills Mr. Ennis. Mr. Ennis's law partner, side note, was also a woman, the only woman attorney in Milledgeville, Georgia at the time, and had represented a couple of African-American folks who had sued him in his loan sharking businesses. He then goes around the corner and shoots Mr. Bevins, another young attorney who had represented his wife in their divorce proceedings, in which she was alleging a series of physical and mental abuse. So he kills these 2 prominent figures and then turns the gun on himself. I think that this is an example of the criminal law not doing what it's supposed to. He is free when he should be in jail. And Mr. Bevins was the exact age as Flannery O'Connor was, born in the same year. She no doubt would have known him. He grew up in Milledgeville, etc. So there's this terrible crime following a failure of the criminal law. Now let's look at the Partridge Festival, okay? She makes a lot of statements about the law, direct and indirect. Directly, she talks about the law. Of course, the law has failed to protect these innocent people who've been shot, right? Who've been shot and killed. She describes it as taking place at the steps of the courthouse, which would be right here, steps of the courthouse. Singleton appeared in a side door on the courthouse porch with silent automatic pistol and shot 5 of the dignitaries seated there, and by mistake, a person in the crowd. But indirectly, I think she makes a comment about the law as well, because you will recall that Mr. Singleton had been publicly humiliated in a very grotesque way prior to this, where by his refusal to participate in the ritual of buying the pin for the Azalea Festival, she describes it as he had been tried by a mock court on the courthouse lawn for not buying this badge. During the trial, he had been imprisoned in a pair of stocks. When convicted, he was locked in a jail together with a goat and who was tried for the same offense. The jail was an outdoor privy borrowed for the occasion by the JC. So this public mock trial on the courthouse lawn precedes this. And I would argue that she's using this violence to shock her characters, but she's using it, all right, as a catalyst for what is to follow. And she talks about this, right? She talks about finding that the subject in fiction is an action of grace in a territory largely held by the devil, trying to highlight to folks that there is evil out there. There's things out there that people should be aware of, etc. And her reality, so in the story, excuse me, this lots of things can be violent. She chooses often crimes, and she chooses often the criminal law, and the criminal law failing to protect the vulnerable to trigger events. And I would suggest that that's what took place in the Partridge Festival, and that mirrors what took place in real life. Ms. Johnikin's homicide is never taken seriously. The victims of loan sharking are ignored. And ultimately, what holds him responsible is an income tax charge, a very Al Capone thing, not a real point. And scholars have talked about this. It's not just that the law fails, but it fails to protect the vulnerable. As Gary Cuba points out, she writes a lot about the poor and those who are typically excluded by this post-world culture, and that she has a long concern for the outcast, a critic of hidden victimization, right? And she wrote in a letter herself, the one who is right is usually the victim. Now, I focus on the Partridge Festival. You all are much deeper O'Connor scholars than myself. Probably other stories are going through your head. The life you save can be your own. Is a sex trafficking case? It is. If you don't believe me, that's what forced marriage is. We can talk about it. The violent bear it away, a failure of child protection. I know, my daughter's in the crowd and she's like, this is my life, people. But everything is like that. The misfit, right? A failure to rehabilitate him in the prison has triggered these events that are going to take place. But I want to focus on a second trial I would suggest you also influenced a real life event, a failure of the criminal justice system, or the legal system, I should say, to protect the vulnerable. And it's really probably the classic example. And that would be Jesus, right? Innocent, went to the courts numerous times, went to the law, I should say, not protected, released for a known criminal, a known murderer instead. And this photo is taken from St. John the Evangelist Cathedral in Savannah. And while I was sitting there, what struck me about it is these things are totally violent, three-dimensional. This isn't your run-of-the-mill Irish Catholic parish in Massachusetts where I'm from, a painting. These are very powerful. And yesterday when we heard Ms. Gordon talk, she talks about how Flannery went to these Sunday masses, 3-hour masses, wanted to be with the adults. And she's looking at these images her whole childhood. And I would speculate that this also influenced her, is my theory here. An actual crime and thinking about the law, but its failure to protect. Because if what are we experiencing today in the United States? If the law fails, it is not unlike an absence of God, an absence of order, an absence of the system working in some way. That's a very scary proposition. And if one's vocation is to have people feel the presence of grace and to be open to it, illustrating to them a situation in which there is no order, there is no protection, there is no law, can make one feel extremely vulnerable as well. So I would just suggest that for purposes of time. Let me just talk a little bit on the second part of the paper for just literally 1 minute. Those of you who think I'm making this up, the paper goes on to talk about how there's, I would say, a philosophical sharing between O'Connor and lawyers who advocate on behalf of the vulnerable, and a practical one. The philosophical one I have on the left, quotes of hers about her approach to vocation, but I would just suggest to you that the law, even though you're all going to make lawyer jokes to me for the rest of the weekend, the law is a vocation, especially for lawyers who represent the vulnerable and the marginalized. I include prosecutors in that because my victims were exactly those folks, but this could speak to civil rights attorneys, criminal defense attorneys, etc. Literally giving voice to the voiceless, to people who've been selected because they're marginalized and won't be believed, victimized in that way, and then in the actual court of law, treated that way. And when O'Connor, but I think there's a real practical experience as well. Her talking about speaking to a hostile audience is very much what lawyers for the marginalized do. They are saying, listen to this person, even if they're not like you, even if they're not really articulate, etc. And I would suggest to you for the criminal prosecutor, it is even more so like that. It is structurally set up with the burden of beyond a reasonable doubt that the prosecutor has to overcome what you should be hostile to the message, so to speak. And that's how it should be, right? So prosecutors and lawyers in general, who are on behalf of folks, are trying to speak to this hostile audience. I want to make one more quick point and then I'll wrap it up. This idea that the jury is hostile, I've already proven you can't always indict a ham sandwich, but there's an actual thing when we're dealing with crimes of exploitation, abuse, etc., that has been documented, and that's on the right, research of jurors. And jurors are very skeptical of these claims. And in fact, there's some research that suggests this idea of victim blaming is something called defensive attribution. I don't want to believe what you are telling me, because if I accept these facts, this really violent case, this person hurt this child, this person who is a pillar of society is actually engaged in other criminal activity, that will make me feel less safe. So that's what a prosecutor is up against. And I would argue to you, very similar to what O'Connor talked about in her writing about the hostile audience, trying to use violence then in order to create, in order to reach them, to move them, and to help them see the truth. So the article goes into these examples of where O'Connor can become, provide a vocational framework for prosecutors. And I list all of them, and I just want to close with the last sort of piece here, where if prosecutors, and with my own law students, if they can approach their work with the same vocation that O'Connor has done, the kind of vocation that when you're sick, you pray for the work, not for your own health. If that happens, well, like in her stories, they can't control the endings, okay? They have to be confident that if they follow these pieces of guidance that she has for them, the value of speaking for the vulnerable will win out. And maybe 100 years later, people will be talking about how well you did it. I welcome any thoughts at the end. Thank you for your attention. And I really wanted to get this slide where I couldn't show Flannery. Thank you very much.
You can do it.
Okay. I mean, I probably can, but I'll open a garage door somewhere like 3 blocks away.
Well, turn things right over to Casey.
I think she's gonna get.
Yeah, go ahead. When we're ready. You don't have spots, right? He's in it. Yeah, you don't have. I don't. Okay, cool. Just ignore that. Yeah.
All right. I'm very old school, so I'm reading you a paper. Hopefully I'll be animated and you can stick with me, but I do not have any slides for you today. So I'm Casey Schlafsky. I just completed my first year as a PhD student at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland. I'm in the divinity program there, and I'd love to share today with you just some thoughts about the role of prophets, specifically in the violent bear it away, and hope to give you something to chew on. So in her essay, Some Aspects of the Grotesque in Southern Fiction, Flannery O'Connor claims, quote, "Since the 18th century, the popular spirit of each succeeding age has tended more and more to view that the ills and mysteries of life will eventually fall before the scientific advances of man," end quote. O'Connor was fully aware of the irony that these scientific advances resulted in unprecedented destruction of life and matter in her very lifetime, and she was not shy with her critique. She certainly held the suspicion that modernity exchanged God and the church, both of which held for her the mysteries of life. Modernity exchanged God and the church for qualities of autonomy, rationality, and certainty. When O'Connor makes mention of the modern man or modernity, I think she's referring to the intellectual and social movement away from traditional ideas and cultural values and towards contemporary values and beliefs in scientific rationalism and liberalism. And chief among her concerns was the modern emphasis on self-invention and freedom. For the modern individual, these qualities progress humanity ever forward. But to where or to whom are we moving forward? Just what is the telos of the modernity narrative that O'Connor deems so problematic? In Novelist and Believer, O'Connor succinctly outlines a counter-narrative to her unbelieving age, as she refers to it. She believes in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, which is particular and historic, one who is unlimited and, quote, revealed himself specifically, who confounds the senses and sensibilities, one known early on as a stumbling block. There is no way to gloss over this specification or to make it more acceptable to modern thought. This God is the object of ultimate concern, and he has a name. Within her Christian framework, a life untethered from the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob will result in self-worship, which gives a sense of false freedom. And as Ralph Wood describes, quote, the alleged freedom of self-invention is, for Flannery, the ultimate slavery, whereas the total disposal of human life into the hands of God is ultimate freedom, end quote. But for O'Connor, this freedom is costly. Furthermore, for O'Connor, the ills of modernity weren't confined to secular spaces. They found their way into the church. O'Connor had an accurate read on Nietzsche, whose often misunderstood adage, God is dead, is really a descriptive of the state of religion and the church. People were living as if God were dead. According to Wood, Nietzsche was, quote, protesting the massive vacancy of soul that, largely unrecognized, characterizes modern religious life in the West. Nietzsche saw that the sweet deity of the complacent middle classes has little, if anything, to do with the startling, strange God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Jesus Christ, end quote. Rather, what O'Connor saw within the modern religious expression was an idolatry of self-deification, a turning of God into our own image, a supreme being that looks an awful lot like me, just a little better, a little more refined. This modern religious life shares in common with the modern man one prominent feature, me, that is the individual, who is the center, model, and judge of my own universe. This directly contrasts with the heart of O'Connor's worldview, which she reveals throughout her corpus. It's also typified here when she says, quote, we lost our innocence in the fall, and our return to it is through the redemption which was brought about by Christ's death and by our slow participation in it, end quote. Indeed, a worldview that sees the central purpose of one's life as a submission to a crucified God is in stark contrast to a vision of God that is merely a better version of ourselves, who exists for our benefit according to our self-assessed righteous deeds. To press against this false image of God, O'Connor must create a foil, a counter image to reveal the false gods of modernity for what they are. Enter the prophet. Prophets in O'Connor's stories function very similarly to the prophets in the Old Testament. They seek to destabilize, deconstruct, and expose false beliefs about the self in relation to God. This is a much needed move if O'Connor's words are going to rouse the blind and deaf reader. Theologian Walter Brueggemann describes the vocation of a prophet is to, quote, nurture, nourish, and evoke a consciousness and perception alternative to the consciousness and perception of the dominant culture around us, end quote. Brueggemann terms the consciousness of the dominant culture the royal consciousness. O'Connor might refer to it as the spirit of our age. Brueggemann further explains that the prophet's job is to usher in an alternative consciousness through critique, which delegitimizes the royal, that is dominant consciousness. And then the prophet must energize by sparking in the people an imagination for a hope-filled future of true liberation and renewed humanity. This is no easy task, to be sure, but I'm confident that O'Connor would resonate with Brueggemann's theology of prophecy. And any careful reader of O'Connor's works intuit, as many have rightfully pointed out, that her stories function prophetically too, in a similar way to those Old Testament radicals. As George Kilcourse aptly puts it, a prophet, quote, helps us to understand that a changed social reality comes about only when the false pretenses of the oppressive culture's myths and gods are made apparent and then dismantled. For the purposes of this discussion, I'm concerned with characters I think function prophetically in the violent Berida way. The most obvious choice is, of course, Mason Tarwater. Mason is our quintessential image of the prophet. He's radical, peculiar, separated from society, and his message is to, quote, proclaim the destruction awaiting a world that has abandoned its savior. Yet there's an ironic twist in old Mason's character that we must pay careful attention to. Mason warned the city that had abandoned its savior of their imminent divine judgment of destruction via blood and fire. Yet, when the judgment came, it came upon Mason himself, not the city, and it burned his blood clean. The burning gaze of God shifted from the so-called heathen and instead pierced Mason in an act that only Mason could describe as one of mercy. Mason goes on to explain that in heeding God's call, the Lord used fire to chastise him and to, quote, instruct in the hard facts of serving the Lord. What we see in old prophet Mason is a humility and submission to God that is painful, burdensome, and extreme in a way that could only be sustained by absolute conviction of a real divine call. For Mason and for O'Connor too, identity was formed outside oneself. It was formed by God, who then called the individual into submission and into community. This counter narrative to the self-made individual is what makes Mason's prophet role unique and far more interesting than merely one who pronounces destruction. God, as the ultimate prophet, does exactly as Brueggemann and Kilcourse would expect. God dismantles Mason's beliefs and expectations, and then changes Mason's social reality by reawakening his sense of calling, belonging, and submission to an identity that he never asked for himself. God called Mason into a new social reality where God and Mason both commune and wrestle. Think of Mason going off into the woods to fight his calling. Ultimately, the calling wins out and he submits. It's in this submission that he finds true freedom. What's more is that Mason wants this for his nephew Rayber, who rejects it and becomes in the novel O'Connor's prototype of the modern man. Our next prophet that we're going to consider is Lucette Carmody. In a pivotal scene, Rayber follows young Tarwater to a revival meeting. Rayber won't enter the building, but instead watches and listens from outside the window. The meeting opens with the preacher introducing the Carmody family, an itinerant trio that travels the world so their disabled daughter, Lucette, can preach to various kings and rulers, or so they claim. Lucette's mother opens the evening with a prelude describing her family's travels and influence, all the while playing up the audience for money. So we as the readers quickly anticipate the upcoming antics of a shyster, and so does Rayber. As the Carmodys take stage, Rayber begins a series of flashbacks to his childhood trauma of being kidnapped by his Uncle Mason and his subsequent retrieval from his uncaring father. The scene vacillates back and forth between Rayber's memories and what is happening on stage. However, what pours forth from Lucette appears to be genuine conviction about the love of God through the incarnation of Jesus as the Word of God. She is not a fraud. She is a true believer. In true prophet form, her words dismantle the dominant religious views of Jesus that O'Connor worked hard to counter. Lucette's narrative of the incarnation depicts two contrasting images of Jesus. The first is the image of a king that seems fitting, royal, grand, worthy of the finest gifts. And she rejects that. But the second image is of Jesus who came humbly and lowly as a, quote, blue, cold child from a woman, quote, plain as the winter. It's nothing grand, nothing beautiful. While Lucette insists Jesus's love, she describes his love as the love that, quote, cuts like the cold wind of winter. She also says that Jesus is the Word of God, and the Word is there to burn you clean. Cutting and burning are the dominant images in her sermon. These images of pain and suffering square with O'Connor's conviction that true religion costs the believer. It is not, as she said in one letter, a big electric blanket. I cannot help but hear echoes of Karl Barth, who, by the way, O'Connor read and enjoyed and praised, which makes me happy because I really like Barth. But I hear echoes of Barth in her sermon. Barth spent his life constructing a theology that was, in large part, reacting to the way in which the modern concerns stemming from the Enlightenment onward affected the church. Barth held a sacramental view of preaching. Barth says that the preachers, quote, make statements which demand faith from their hearers. They make assertions about final truth, not only in existence, but above it. They place before the I of the hearers a thou whom they cannot overlook or dissolve or transcend. Those who speak about God want to set people before God to claim them for God, end quote. So when we consider Lucett's sermon, we see Barth's call to preachers and prophets in action. In her pleading with Raber to listen to the holy word in her mouth, she says it over and over again, she is placing the thou before the I, God, for Raber. And she's reminding Raber, you've been claimed. Of course, that scares him off greatly. That's an understatement. Okay, our last example. Early in the novel, Mason shocks the reader by claiming that God preserved young Bishop from corruption by his unbelieving parents by making him dim-witted. Most contemporary readers would rightfully stumble over this paragraph. Not only is the word choice offensive, the claim that God would intentionally disable a human for his own purposes raises questions of theodicy and of divine goodness. We haven't time to work out these questions or speculate on O'Connor's answers, but they're worthy of exploration for sure. Instead, I want you to think back to Brueggemann and Kilcourse's claims about the role of a prophet. To summarize again, the role of the prophet is to confront and dismantle oppressive cultural myths to bring about a new social reality. And I argue that Bishop does just this, and Mason was the first to recognize it, thus his offensive comment. But Raber also knows that his own worldview is challenged by his son's disability. O'Connor writes that despite his best attempts to be rational, Raber, quote, had not conquered the problem of Bishop, end quote. The problem for Raber, to be specific, is that Bishop lacks reason and intelligence, yet still compels his father's love, and not just any love, but a love that is overwhelming and irrational. A love that would violently set upon Raber if he looked at Bishop too long. He describes this kind of love as, quote, love without reason, love for something futureless, love that appeared to exist only to be itself, imperious and all demanding, the kind that would cause him to make a fool of himself in an instant, end quote. There's an interesting moment during the scene where Raber is looking in on Lucett's sermon. He says he wants to gather up all the exploited children and make things right. He says that, quote, Bishop is exploited by the very fact that he is alive, end quote. Well, this is a really shocking statement. For someone to be exploited, there has to be an exploiter. And who is it in the case of Bishop? Well, I think undoubtedly Raber thinks it's God that's doing the exploiting. And though it's not outright stated, you can almost hear the internal dialogue of Raber. If God could allow such a creature as Bishop to exist with all his incapacity and vulnerability, God must be cruel and weak, for what deity could make such a mistake? Yet he believes Bishop to be made in the image of God. Quote, he did not believe that he himself was formed in the image and likeness of God, but that Bishop was, he had no doubt, end quote. Unbeknownst to him, and in a manner only the most Christ-haunted of O'Connor's characters could do, Raber is working out his theological anthropology. Here's his logic. Because Bishop makes no sense, and Bishop is made in the image of God, God must also make no sense. The creation images the creator. Perhaps Raber could just walk away with his demoralizing conclusion about Bishop and God. Perhaps he could lay it to rest if it weren't for that outrageous love that came rushing from some inexplicable part of himself. I want to make another connection here to Brueggemann's theology of prophecy. If the role of the prophet is to dismantle the royal consciousness to bring about a new social reality, how is the new social reality constructed? It is not sufficient to merely dismantle, one must also construct. The rub Brueggemann offers is that we are often so deeply ingrained by the royal consciousness that we have no imagination for an alternative. Brueggemann says, quote, "We need to ask if our consciousness and imagination have been so assaulted and so co-opted by the royal consciousness that we have been robbed of the courage or power to think an alternative thought." To put this in the context of the novel, Raber has been so co-opted by values of modernity that he lacks either the courage or power to imagine a different reality for himself. But I'd argue that Raber lacks the courage and power because he lacks the courage and power, but he gets glimpses of a new imagined reality every time the inexplicable and overwhelming love for Bishop pours out of the depths of his being. These senseless moments of love prompted by Bishop haunt Raber just enough to keep him from being totally captivated by the royal consciousness. Here in these moments where the divine mystery that O'Connor cherished so much herself, there is hope. One more point from Brueggemann. He explains that for those entrapped by the royal consciousness to break free and imagine an alternative reality, they must come to terms with death, because one of the hallmarks of succumbing to the royal consciousness is an inability to care or suffer, and an apathetic posture that essentially says, hey, the way things are the way things are. Brueggemann says this is exactly how so-called kings, those gatekeepers of the royal dominant consciousness, that's how they want it to be. If you are numb and apathetic, you will not seek to question the royal consciousness. Brueggemann says, quote, "The royal consciousness leads people to numbness, especially to numbness about death. It is the task of prophetic ministry and imagination to bring people to engage their experiences of suffering to death," end quote. Now let's apply this to Raber. He fights hard his desire to care and suffer for Bishop. He spends his life fighting the urge by setting up a, quote, rigid ascetic discipline that kept himself upright on a very narrow line between madness and emptiness. And when the time came for him to lose his balance, he, Raber, intended to lurch toward emptiness and fall on the side of his choice. Raber wants to be numb to Bishop, but the battle is fierce, and his defeat is only one long gaze away. I believe that the moments of overwhelming love Raber experiences with Bishop are O'Connor's way of refusing Raber to give into completely the numbness brought about by his stubborn insistence to carve out the life he would choose for himself, rather than a submission to his family's vocational call. On some level, Raber is experiencing what O'Connor articulated in her prayer journal, quote, "The reality of death has come upon us, and a consciousness of the power of God has broken our complacency like a bullet in the side. A sense of the dramatic, of the tragic, of the infinite has descended upon us, filling us with grief, but even above grief, wonder. Our plans were so beautifully laid out, ready to be carried to action, but with magnificent certainty, God laid them aside and said, 'Have you forgotten mine?'" End quote. Actually, Raber hadn't forgotten God's call. He just did everything in his power to ignore, deny, and grow deaf to it. Bishop, like his great uncle Mason, made it impossible for him to forget. In the end, when Raber witnesses the drowning/baptism of his son, he waits for the pain and grief to come and swallow him up, but it doesn't come. He remains in his numbness. Perhaps he has, like Pharaoh, despite old prophet Moses's warnings, been given over to his true heart's desire. Thank you.
See here, I'm up to date. That's good to know. Go. This, and get this to. There we go.
All right, thank you guys very much. Very happy to be here, excited for the conversation we're about to have. I will try to telescope, skim through a couple of things if I can to get us to Q&A conversation a little bit faster.
But for now, it's easy to see how O'Connor, who insisted that you have to push as hard as the age that pushes against you, comes to be read in opposition to something like autonomous, the modern age, nihilism, some of the spirit of the age that Casey was talking about. A basket of categories, ideas, and values that I'm going to refer to today as secular. But I think that opposition is a misleading framework for O'Connor's relationship with secular culture, with her age, with modernity. Today, I want to argue that O'Connor scrambles the categories of religious and secular by exploring her engagement with one major discourse of mid-century culture heavily coded as secular, namely psychoanalysis. O'Connor uses psychoanalytic accounts of desire and the self to develop novel representations of religious desire while challenging the secular circumscription that Freud and his followers gave to that framework. But first, I want to talk a bit about that oppositional framing between O'Connor and secularity, unbelief, or the modern world. Because when we accept that those terms of debate, secular versus religious, and accept that O'Connor's on one side, certain debates that we tend to have become unresolvable. Some years ago, Timothy Caron divided O'Connor critics into true believers who put O'Connor's religious meanings at the center of their readings and apostates who write about politics, race, material culture, or other questions. But more than a difference of focus divides those modes of criticism. Often, true believers frame their readings as for O'Connor and for religion or Catholicism or some critique of the modern world. Apostates position themselves as critical of those things. Caron himself, an avowed apostate, exemplifies that oppositional framing. He argues that O'Connor's fiction is, quote, less about salvational concerns and more about a Southern dread of encroaching blackness or the erosion of social customs such as racial segregation. Assuming that to be more about race, the text must be less about salvation. I want to ask, why is that the case? And some critics have challenged that framing. Nevertheless, I think that a lot of criticism, a lot of readings of O'Connor in a popular sense as well, tend to fall into it. I don't mean to single out Caron. I always refer to him because I find him so thoughtful and useful a descriptor of these patterns in O'Connor's scholarship. I certainly fall into this oppositional framing as well. And the small body of scholarship on O'Connor and psychoanalysis evinces that same assumption that one must choose between O'Connor's Catholic convictions and psychoanalytic ideas. Readings will frame themselves as being either for O'Connor, for Catholicism, or taking a psychoanalytic approach, generally deconstructive of O'Connor's perspective. But framing our readings for or against O'Connor or religion leaves the categories of religious and secular themselves unquestioned. When we do so, we reinscribe the relegation of religion to a separate sphere, irrelevant to the rest of life, that O'Connor's work challenges. O'Connor wrote in the heyday of the secularization thesis, a broad, often unstated assumption that religion is a product of a limited stage of human development and would fade as humanity matured. Religion was at best a private affair. Frequently, it was irrational and violent. Secularity was framed as the enlightened understanding that would free subjects from arbitrary power and tradition. Talal Assad and others have argued that religion provided the image of human enslavement itself and irrationality, which underwrote the liberatory projects of modernity. Religious ideas, quote, had to be constituted as categories of illusion and oppression before people could be liberated from them. In accounts like these, in many accounts, modernity simply is the liberation of the subject from a religious past. And so in addition to the sort of secular religious divide, we've got a present past divide introduced in a lot of these accounts. A past that's at once social, pre-modern religious societies and imaginaries, and biographical, individual childhood, with maturity figured as the subject's freedom from complexes derived from that past. Are with me so far? Okay. The secularization thesis then turns on a conception of secularity as a universal normal remainder, what's left behind that every person has when religion fades or is removed. Religion then becomes something different and super added. The creativity of O'Connor's project is that she draws on psychoanalysis to evade the binary between religious and secular by challenging the normalcy of the secular, that modern age. As she reads psychoanalytic theory, O'Connor learns to identify a religious imagination and religious desires within the secular. She depicts mid-century unbelief as the symptom of a transcendent desire that's been repressed. Secularity is not what's left over when religion is withdrawn, but is a way of relating to desires that persist. In the prayer journal that she kept at the University of Iowa, O'Connor turns a psychoanalytic account of religion's origin into a tool for distinguishing between authentic and inauthentic religion. Religion based on fear of hell is religiously insufficient because it is psychoanalyzable. She writes that she does, quote, not want it to be fear which keeps me in the church. Because, quote, learned people can analyze and, quote, away the fear of hell, turning it into the neurotic complex that Freud imagines all religion to be. So religion based on fear essentially is susceptible to the psychoanalytic critique. However, she finds within herself a desire to experience the love of God, and finds that the fear-based, quote, explanations of the psychologists can't explain it away, declaring, quote, I don't want to fear to be out, I want to love to be in. So the recognition that some religious motivations are psychoanalyzable and some don't fit with explanations of someone like Freud becomes her marker for where authentic religion is found in her own devotional life. Locating the source of contemplation in an unpredictable and unconscious desire for God, she calls it, quote, divine desire. And she imagines that as a Freudian libido, a desire that can be present consciously or unconsciously, and one that can be repressed but not eliminated. When she struggles to pray, she finds that sometimes grace wells up from her unconscious, quote, at some insipid moment when I may possibly be thinking of floor wax or pigeon eggs, the opening of a beautiful prayer may come up from my subconscious and lead me to write something exalted. O'Connor takes over Freud's mechanism of substitution, but she reverses its direction, saying in a later passage, quote, man's desire for God is bedded in the unconscious and seeks to satisfy itself in physical possession of another human. This necessarily is a passing, fading attachment in its sensuous aspects, since it is a poor substitute for what the unconscious is after. The unconscious in that framing is really after communion with God. Even in this case, a romantic or sexual relationship can be a defense against that desire. Mystical vision moves in and through the unconscious, and cooperation with grace is figured as the acceptance of that unconscious. Resistance to grace, then, it's at least situated or suggested, even at this point, becomes a form of repression. Real quickly, I'm going to jump forward a little bit, but I like to tie that moment in the prayer journal when the prayer wells up from her subconscious with the passage that Casey pointed to of Raber's mystical vision on seeing Bishop. He finds that this desire wells up from him, this sort of love for Bishop wells up from him, and he tries to keep that restraint. But moving forward just a bit, O'Connor moves into the 50s, reads Carl Jung, and in the course of reading him and some other deaf psychologists, develops intuitions from her prayer journal. I'm sorry, I've got another slide here. Nope, here. There we go. Develops intuitions from her prayer journal into a broad vision of mid-century culture. Jung presents the denial of religious desire as a civilization-wide sickness and imagines modernity as a psychological defense against religious longings. In a passage that O'Connor marked in her personal copy of Modern Man in Search of a Soul, thanks to Milledgeville for letting me consult those, Jung writes that, quote, General conceptions of a spiritual nature are indispensable constituents of psychic life. Their relative absence or their denial by a civilized people is therefore to be regarded as a sign of degeneration. Jung comes to regard bourgeois secularity as an infantile neurosis. And this is the passage I have here on the slide. However far-fetched it may sound, many neuroses are caused by the fact that people blind themselves to their own religious promptings because of a childish passion for rational enlightenment. There's a lot that O'Connor takes from Jung, a lot of interesting stuff here. To sum it up, I would suggest that in O'Connor's thought, she comes to see that what Freud did for sex, Jung did for religion. He aimed to help patients recognize a desire that hadn't gone away when they refused to acknowledge it. However, O'Connor disagrees with Jung about the object of religious desire. Jung thought that what humans ultimately want are what he calls, quote, general conceptions of a spiritual nature. In other words, they want to sort of see the world and themselves in a spiritual light. They want to find a kind of transcendent meaning. And so he encourages them to rethink and reorient the way that they think about the world. For O'Connor, though, modernity's crucial unmet desire isn't a desire to see the world spiritually. It's a desire for God, a real being outside of oneself, whom one can love and whose love one wants. To satisfy such a desire, one needs to go outside of oneself. And I think it's really interesting that O'Connor actually turns to Freud, the arch-atheist, to develop an account of religious desire that reconciles the subject with a real object. In this, she is deeply influenced by a long article by Father Albert Play, a French Dominican, who argues that Freud shares with St. Thomas Aquinas a desire to orient individuals toward outside reality. In this, what I think of as the Freudian Thomistic account, subject's desires draw him toward reality. Neurosis and sin both arise when a subject refuses to engage or acknowledge that. And so it becomes a fear of one's own desires because those desires are connected to reality. Freud attributes repression to an ego that, quote, feels a demand from an instinct which it wishes to withstand because it suspects that satisfaction is dangerous, would evoke a collision with the outside world, and that pathological states of the ego, this is the passage I have on the screen, arise when there's a slackening of its relation to the external world. Unlike the reading of Freud that O'Connor encountered at Iowa, this account unites an acknowledgement of deep unconscious desire with the subject's reconciliation with reality. So we've moved from seeing Freud simply as analyzing something within the mind and more towards analyzing the connection between desire and the outside world, taking the subject out of what she calls the little box in her prayer journal, this kind of enclosed sense of being that's removed from the world and in which we can see, I think, the patterns of grace in a lot of O'Connor's characters. As she writes The Violent Bear It Away, O'Connor comes to put these pieces together and imagine modern secularity as the repression of religious desires, which leads to neurotic illusions. She offers a condensed symbol of her account in a sermon by the child preacher Lucette Carmody. And I'm really glad that Casey pointed to this. I love the Carmody sermon. I think it's fascinating. Carmody, what I want to pay attention to is the way that Carmody presents the crucifixion of Jesus as a violent disavowal of transcendent desire. Preaching in a storefront tabernacle church while Rayburn and Tarwater watch through a window, she depicts the incarnation as the long-promised satisfaction of desire. Quote, the people, end quote, I'm summarizing here, longed for God and begged him to come quickly. And Carmody evokes that desire and this extensive poetic metaphoric imagery. I'll give you just a bit. The people promised, quote, a golden fleece for his bed, silver and gold and peacock tails, 1,000 sons and a peacock's tail for his sash. Now, God sends Jesus to answer their desires, saying, I'll give them my very breath for theirs. But when Jesus comes, the people don't like what they see. And I think this is important. Unlike the gospel accounts, in which doubts, questions, debates about Jesus' identity play a crucial role. The Pharisees and Pontius Pilate, Pilate questions Jesus, the Pharisees seek his execution because they reject his claim to be the Son of God. Lucette depicts a world that crucifies Jesus in the full knowledge that he's the Son of God. Jesus raises the dead, Lazarus and others, in miracles that symbolize the new life that he offers, God's way of satisfying that longing for transcendent love that Carmody says the people had expressed long ago. The people kill Jesus for raising the dead. The world shouted, "Leave the dead lie. The dead are dead and can stay that way. What do we want with the dead alive?" They kill Jesus because he offers to satisfy desires that they wish to disavow, which turns the crucifixion into this symbolic act of repression. After the crucifixion, the repressed returns, and the people's memory of the desire that Jesus might have satisfied haunts the, quote, peace and ease that they aimed at when they killed him. Quote, "They hadn't but only said it when they wanted him to come again. Their eyes were opened and they saw the glory they had killed." In Freud's sense, Christ is uncanny because mid-century unbelief has become an attempt to escape its own desire for the transcendent love that he represents. Now, in Carmody's account, what kind of violence is the crucifixion? It's not religious violence as frequently figured, that is, violence motivated by religious desires and aims, in the way that, for instance, the Pharisees are motivated in the Gospels. It's not secular violence, violence that moves along secular lines and reasons in the way that the violence of Pontius Pilate is in the Gospels. As an attempt to shield the subject from a threatening, unacknowledged desire, it partakes of the irrationality that Freud and many others in this period construct as religious. But it's an attempt to establish a secular, modern, sort of autonomous identity by expelling a transcendent desire that threatens that identity. Thus, it locates religious violence within the construction of the secular subject. In this way, it resembles the novel's other acts of violence, notably, think of Tarwater's drowning of Bishop, in an attempt to convince himself that he doesn't really want to baptize Bishop. Actions like those become neurotic attempts to inscribe secularity on a subject who, deep down, longs for something else. For O'Connor, then, the secular is not, in the end, a loss of faith, a desire for autonomy, or an absence left behind when religion departs, or it's all of those things, but there's something further going on. It's the repression of desires that religion once satisfied. The Violent Buried Away depicts mid-century culture's deepest motivation as an attempt to escape its desire for God's love. Freud taught her to see, interestingly, that when subjects flee their own desires, those desires return. As she put it in a famous line in some aspect of the grotesque in Southern fiction, quote, "The Southerner, who isn't convinced of it, is very much afraid he may have been formed in the image and likeness of God. Ghosts can be very fierce and instructive. They cast strange shadows, particularly in our literature." I want to suggest that O'Connor's interest in ghosts is closely akin to Freud's, that both see them as indicating, in the end, not actually something that perhaps in a superficial sense is forgotten, but something that in a more fundamental sense is remembered on an unconscious level, that a subject wishes not to admit. That the concept of the uncanny is really important in the way O'Connor imagines secularity, modernity, the autonomous subject. This entails further that the novel's acts of violence are not, as I think they are in some of O'Connor's earlier work, the grotesque vehicle of love, but they've become the frightened response of a subject. And actually they are, in some cases, they're like this even in the early work. The frightened response of a subject who will not acknowledge love because he's afraid of losing it, and even more afraid of not losing it. They're a substitute in Freud's sense for love. And it's love, not violence, that becomes the deepest, most scandalous, and most terrifying truth. Thank you guys very much, and I think it's time for us to move on to questions.
Little bit of time. Jessica in the back.
Yeah, thank you all. Three great presentations. I want to start with a question for Mary. I don't know anything about going to law school, but is there room in a law school classroom to bring in literature, Flannery O'Connor, or anything else?
Let's hope so.
Have you done that?
So yeah, so many law schools will have law and literature classes of different scopes. One of them, some highly intellectual. There's a kind of a famous book that came out about 15 years ago, The Law and Harry Potter, which has different, one of my colleagues is a contract professor, so she wrote about that in another chapter. So there is, but I think as well, there's a unique place in religiously affiliated law schools, right? To sort of talk about the spiritual aspects of O'Connor as well. Law curriculums are very tight, frankly, because we have that pesky thing called the bar exam. So there's a little bit of room, but as many of you are experiencing in your own educational institutions, there's that tension between specialization and generalization. So my belief is that the law and literature space has declined a little bit as specialization becomes more marketable for law students, but there is room for it. And I'm hopeful that this paper is going to be part of some programming that we're doing next year.
Yeah, I hope so, because your presentation really brought home for me, like how literature can humanize the law, so.
Good. Thanks.
I think there's a gospel in the Harry Potter version too, for those who.
Yeah, it's very, it is a very religious text.
I can't attest to it, but.
Yes.
Thank you so much for all your presentations. I'm trying to kind of wrangle them all together into like a coherent question. And one of the things that I was thinking about is, so why make art, right? In what ways is art an intervention in the midst of all these thorny questions about love and fear and trembling and loathing? And so what sort of art is storytelling, and how is the storytelling art of O'Connor an intervention in the problems that you are identifying? Like, what does it do? What does art do, I suppose? Or is it just, this is what I can do. This is my vocation. This is the little widget that I can make. Obviously not for O'Connor, it's a vocation, but if you could speak to that.
Take first stab.
Yeah, I mean, first I would say, O'Connor, you mentioned vocation, Mary. I mean, O'Connor, a lot of her thoughts around her vocation as a writer was formed by Jacques Maritain. And so I would suggest to read Maritain, and although I don't find him particularly easy to read, but you'll see how his views of art and the role of an artist really formed O'Connor's view of herself and her calling. But I think a big theme for her would be that art is incarnational, and it is taking, it is like fleshing out these truths, like with a capital T, and giving it flesh and making it concrete. And there's just something about us as humans that just relate to that in a way that other things don't. And so I think she knew that and felt deeply convinced that it was what she needed to do. I don't know. Maybe that's not very satisfactory. What would you add?
It's a really good question. It's making me think of Plato's Ion. This short dialogue in which Socrates confronts Ion who is one of these Greek rhapsodes. He traveled around and performed Homeric poems. And he was seen as wise, and Socrates asked him questions, and it turns out he doesn't really know things. He just taps into the spirit of the muse and performs them. And I think there's a sort of superficial reading of that dialogue as a critique of rhapsodes, critique of poetry and art, because the artist doesn't know in the articulable sense that Socrates does. And I think the dialogue is actually much more sympathetic to Ion, and Socrates is more sympathetic to Ion than it sometimes gets credit for. That Ion, as the artist, has a way of intuiting and finding things that reason can't yet quite articulate. And I think often that is how art works. Thinking in terms of the work that I'm doing, of course, O'Connor was highly, maybe unusually articulate and philosophically and theologically sharp artist, but it's still the case that the sort of exploratory power of art enables her to discover things that I haven't found anyone from her period articulating in quite the terms in which she's able to do. And I certainly think she does it much more robustly. There are critics writing in the last 5-10 years that are starting to articulate some of the things I find O'Connor writing in the 1950s. So there's a way in which she is sort of trusting the muse, and then the philosophers will catch up. Maybe the lawyers will too.
Maybe they will. I have a more practical answer, less intellectual than my colleague Bill. In law, I feel like I'm talking to my law school class. I reject the idea that trials are performance, right? Or I reject at least teaching my students that, right? It's got to be substantive. But the art of litigation and appellate litigation or trial litigation is telling a story, right? Ultimately, what you are trying to do is move the jury to sympathize, to be angry, to hold account, etc. Things that in other capacities we say don't do. Don't judge. Well, we really want you to judge here. We really want you to do that, right? So I think art is a real vehicle, right? And it's very helpful, certainly in teaching young lawyers, but even to have them conceptualize their trial. If I can, I thank you for the question I planted. I didn't plant it, but okay. One quote that O'Connor said in a speech at the University of Chicago is, "We can't change what we see to suit the reader, but must convey it as whole as possible into his unspacious quarters for his divided and suspicious consideration." I think that very much speaks to what lawyers need to do. You're suspicious of me. You already hate lawyers, frankly. I mean, the joke we say is the only people that jurors trust, as we've been on juries, is a judge, because he or she has on a robe. And you're trying to figure out, who do I trust here? Well, the person who tells you a story that you can relate to, that you can understand, even if the characters are so different from you, but you can understand that motivation, etc., I think is a tremendous gift for an attorney. So why we make art is for those who are perhaps not in the arts to know how to do their jobs well.
Could I just add just one more thing? Janine Langan, she's since passed, but she's a Canadian philosopher, Catholic, and wrote a really lovely article called The Christian Imagination. Are you familiar with it? Okay. But I would recommend that article to you, Dave, because it's she talks about how the Christian imagination has this unique role of being iconic and sacramental and typological and eschatological, and she unpacks that, and I find it very helpful in articulating the specific way that art can basically bring us. I mean, she's coming at it from a distinctly Christian point of view, but that art, the way that art can draw us in, as she would say, to the face of the beloved. And so, excuse me,
For Mr. Gotch, the idea that we're supposed to scramble the categories between, it can't be a binary of secular versus religious that you're presenting. But you also say that secularity is type of a neurotic complex, which seems to kind of pathologize secularity a little bit, if that's being fair. Okay, so if we read Flannery in these kind of Freudian categories, we can see that the sickness of the mind or the sickness of the soul is related to secularity. How would you describe then her view of actualization? Like, what is it can't just be the solution to secularity is become Catholic. How does she use the Freudian categories, if she does, to say this is the path of health, if she was using a Freudian, repair for the pathology of secularity?
Yeah, very good question. So O'Connor comes to posit, I think, there's long-standing tradition of Christian reflection of positing a sort of inborn desire for God that subjects may acknowledge or not, may obey or not. O'Connor comes to see that as a potentially unconscious desire. And so she comes to see the forms of unbelief that are prominent in mid-century, especially artistic and intellectual culture, as, in fact, various forms of culture as ways of relating to desires, and particularly to this desire for God. So she comes to see what gets called the secular as a repression or avoidance or denial of that desire for God. I use the category of the secular to describe this culture. You could also use some of the various other categories of modernity or the autonomous subject or what you will. I think that O'Connor, so she doesn't think that there is secularity in the sense of someone who just has no religious desire or no sort of way of relating to the spiritual. She thinks of the denial of spiritual reality or the denial of one's spiritual desires as sort of a form of self-deception. Mm-hmm. And she thinks of it particularly through these categories of libidinal repression that derive from Freud. And so when I say that she sort of scrambles the categories of religious and secular, I'm drawing on a body of scholarship that sees both of those as constructed categories coming out of the Enlightenment of the 18th century, and especially the rise of social sciences near the end of the 19th century, in which like both the category of the religious is invented, the category of the secular is invented at about the same time. The category of the religious is sort of invented to explain the secular. I'm sorry, the category of the secular is invented to explain the religious. The religious are those things which are being sought to be excluded. Ultimately, I think they're both largely artificial categories, and O'Connor helps to get out of the bounds of thinking that they tend to create. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks, good.
Okay. Bruce?
Okay. A comment I think all three of you could use. There's a manuscript of the Blind Buried Away in Milledgeville in which Lucette Carmody says he's tired of being I'm paraphrasing here, a criminal for Jesus. And she wants to run away with her daddy, get away from mama, and become a professional dancer. Nobody had ever told me that this manuscript was there. I ran across it recently, and it really shocked me. And I think all three of you can work it in, but it's such a surprising manuscript. Why in the world did her mind go there to write this? It's a short thing, easily missable in the manuscript files. How's that fit for Lucette to call herself a criminal, for example, and for her to be so inclined to just say everything she's been doing is a fraud. And that, she wants to switch it completely. Of course, you don't know from the manuscript when she's having those thoughts. Where this is in the storyline. And so while I was listening to all three of your talks, I thought, well, this is how this person could use that manuscript. And it's so different from everything that ended up in the novel about Lucette. And it makes Lucette a more complicated seeming, character. Some people think she's kind of flat and uninteresting and stereotypical. Oh, I don't think so. And that manuscript, encourages me in that direction. Sorry. Any comments?
Also in one of the editions, originally Bishop was not profoundly intellectually disabled. And but much as I can tell, we don't know when she made that change. We do know from a letter that she said it was absolutely crucial that he became disabled. But she doesn't expand, which is just, as a disability theologian in the making, I'm like, why? I need your answer, Flannery. So.
Yeah, that's an I ran across that when I was in Milledgeville. It's a fascinating passage. I don't quite know what to do with it. I don't want to read it, of course it doesn't make the final cut, and I don't want to read it as controlling the interpretation of the text, but it is really interesting to think about. It's
at the very least, it says she has her struggles, just as the other prophets, and
there may have been a version of the novel in which that sequence, there was something like the Wise Blood encounter with Asa Hawks, the sort of fake prophet in there, potentially that O'Connor was exploring in an early kind of version of this.
nothing simple.
Anything else, or either of you have questions? You're out of time. Oh my goodness. Okay. Thank you guys very much.